Hey guys, Dark Humility here. You can always catch me at twitch.tv/Dark Humility for 6 to 7 days a week of Diablo 2 action. We have some more PD2 guide content for you here today. The last PD2 guide we're going to make for Season 6. Of course, you can catch the rest of my PD2 and D2R guides here, including tier lists and farming area lists and tier lists and more on my YouTube and at maxwell.gg. Today, though, we will be going over optimal maps and map rolling. This is the Season 6 map report. In Season 6, maps have gotten a lot more complicated, but so many more maps have become a lot more viable and useful, and also different mechanics involving a lot more common rarity stat, the fortified stat, and more. And a lot of people are a little bit out of sorts as to exactly what constitutes a good map, when, how, and where. So hopefully this no-nonsense video will help you guys be able to navigate all of that a lot more clearly. There's definitely, of course, a good degree of difficulty with that to some degree, but we'll try to make that as easy to navigate as possible here. Alright. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of complicated stuff, some stuff we probably won't go over, but we'll go over a lot of stuff in the basics in as short of time as possible. So, first thing I want to go over is map rolling. Alright, so for map rolling, hands down, the most important stat, hands down, bar none, no matter what you consider, is going to be rarity. So let's take a look at a typical map with rarity. It could be this one. It could be this one. Monster rarity is essential to rolling a godly map. And the reason being is rarity is more elite packs, more champion packs. Champions are 300% experience, minions and elites are 500% increased experience beyond what regular monsters can provide. So having 40% more monster packs in a map doesn't just mean better experience, it also means crazy loot, as well as their loot odds are also improved for minions, champions, and elites. So even if a map has a lot less density, this is the key stat. In Season 6, rarity is a lot easier to roll, so it's actually realistic to expect you can roll it. Also, there are tons of corruptions that can also produce map rarity as well, which I can attempt to show here. Yep, there you go. That is one just of many corruptions. Of course, this one has a drawback, as most of them do, such as negative all maximum resistances. You can see this one also provides rarity. Overall, corruptions that provide rarity and rules that provide rarity are going to give you the best maps for magic finding and for experience gathering in both solo and group situations. It's just, a simple math of how Diablo 2 has always worked. That is the most important stat, which means even if you roll a map like this, I don't know if that's the best example. Let's see, this one, or let's see. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good example. This one has only 112 density, and you might be thinking, well, why would you hold on to that one? It doesn't have a lot of density. Well, rarity will overcome that. And of course, there's a lot of corruptions that will also add to experience. There's corruptions that add to density and magic find and rarity, and of course, all those things. So it's pretty likely that the map will probably even out. Overall, of course, generally speaking, though, like even a map like this is pretty solid just because of the rarity, even with bad density. It did get the charm corruption, which is very useful if you're looking to generate really good charms and jewelry. So this is a better magic finding type map, but the rarity itself will overcome even other low stats to a very large degree. I would say that like 50% rarity is probably greater than 100 to 150 density, possibly more in terms of value. it's possibly as great as like 200 density by itself, without considering the actual density stat. That's how effective it is in terms of just magic finding and experience potential. I like to emphasize that because a lot of people are trying to figure out, what is the best stat, or what makes the best stats, and what's going to be the most efficient way to me to magic find or gather experience in a solo or group scenario. Either way, rarity for sure is going to make a huge difference. And so getting rarity, if you can, through corruptions or the actual initial roll is very key. Alright, that being said, density and experience is also important when it comes to EXP as well. The EXP stat, getting it north of 20 at the very least, and then of course you can push it a lot higher with things like Standard of Heroes, which provide a combination of density and experience and magic find in a small amount. Can be very easy to do. Of course, you can get a map up to 50% between the initial roll, which is 30%. You can get another 10% through the corruption, and then you can get another 10% through the Standard of Heroes as well. So there definitely can get these tier 3 maps very high. And of course, if we're talking EXP, tier 3 maps cannot be beaten unless you're in a group scenario, and then you're able to do these tier 4 maps, these dungeons, which are very difficult and dangerous to do in hardcore, but we've been able to do them effectively all the time, as long as you have a decent comp with elemental damage. You got the defensive stats, you got summons, you got conviction aura. You just gotta have the right elements fall into place. At any rate, density and experience are also important, but they're not as important as rarity. So EXP and density, this is pretty decent EXP and density. With the corruption, it's likely to get over 20% experience, but if not, it's pretty close, and it's at least likely to get about like 300 density, or it's likely to get some rarity. See, if I try to slam this one here, you can see, well, there you go, it has rarity now. And with rarity plus around 200 density and almost 20 experience, it's going to be a pretty solid map. Not going to be a crazy one, but it's going to be pretty solid. Getting like pretty solid amount of density, experience, and rarity is pretty ideal, of course. And this is an example actually of a map that I just slammed for pure rarity, just an extra giant rarity boost there, and that's going to be insane because that's almost double monster, champion, and elite packs in that map, and that's going to make that map insanely good. Of course, for magic find, rarity is still the top consideration, but the magic find and gold find stat is going to be pretty important as well. It's what really makes it to where you don't need too much on your gear. If you have around 150 to 200 MF on your gear, the rolling a high magic find and gold find stat, or at least a medium one, will make your chance to find items pretty high on that map. And then, of course, density is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about how to increase like things like rune and charm drop rates outside of the specific corruption for that as well. But yeah, whether you slam it or not, these are definitely the most important considerations. Density especially can be very important for certain types of mobs as well, such as flayers, ghosts, and cows, and it really makes use of those particular guest monsters, especially because they're very dense, and with that you're going to get a lot higher of a chance to drop runes and things of that nature. So that's also something to take into account. In general, a map without rarity, you're going to probably want at least 200 density, but of course capping out at 300. Of course, this is without, this is before slamming the map. Of course, with slamming, you can get 400 plus. You can get even higher than 400 with the Standard of Heroes added in, and that stuff is very good as well. Don't feel like you need a Standard of Heroes though. It doesn't do all that much. It's like an extra little tiny boost for people that run lots of Ubers or want to pay a lot in currency to get that extra boost on maps, but it definitely has a pretty sizable impact. Alright, so with all that into consideration, we now understand that rarity is the most important stat. Density can be very important, especially considering certain monster types, and it's just always important in general for certain types of items like charms and runes. Maybe more so, because Magic Find doesn't affect runes, so you gotta consider that as well. And then, of course, Magic Find and Gold Find is very good. If you have a very high amount on a map, you might not even need much on your gear at all, but if you have a pretty solid amount on your gear, it's going to supplement your ability to do that extremely well. Alright, so those are the basics, of course. This also goes for multiple types of maps. For experience, tier 3s are definitely the ideal. However, until you get to about level 96, you can still benefit pretty heavily from experience as a 94 or a 95 character, even in tier 1 maps. And then once you get to like 96, 95, you can still benefit quite a bit from tier 2 maps. By the time you're at 97, though, it's pretty much tier 3 maps or nothing as far as experience goes, or dungeons, of course, in a group scenario. So that's pretty much a pretty solid overview there of how maps work and how you should be trying to roll them. However, Fortification. So there's a new orb in town in Season 6 called an Orb of Fortification. This orb here does exactly what it says on my loot filter here. It provides double loot and double experience at the expense of half of the map's density, increasing the monster's HP by 2 times and increasing the monster damage by 20%. In general, whether you want to fortify a map, which just requires putting a map in the cube with the Fortify orb and pressing transmute, just like with any other way to roll a map or transform a map, such as using all these other map materials you can buy from Anya. In general, it works the same way. Now, Orb of Fortification is extremely good in certain situations, but it's also very useless or bad in other situations. Let's just give an overview real quick of like when you would want to use it. So normally when you want to use it is when you have rarity on the map, at the very least. Medium to high rarity is even better, but low rarity, it kind of depends. And then if you have low density in combination with high rarity, and that's even after slamming it or whatever just to make the map better, that map will typically be a lot better if you fortify it. The reason being is that a low density map, even with high rarity, you can't really make full use of it oftentimes in a normal map scenario, but with this particular orb, you can. Totally can. It will still provide you with tons of elite packs despite there being almost no monster density. So, like for instance, a map like this one potentially would be a good candidate for the Orb of Fortification because it doesn't have very high monster density. There really isn't a way to get it very high, but the rarity count is actually pretty solid. This is a pretty good example, here where the density is 100, maybe even 100 or less, or hovering around 100, maybe no more than 150, and it can do that. If it has more density, a regular map will usually take care of it, and you'll still get a ton of elite packs, and it'll still feel very good, and so you don't really feel the need to fortify. But in this particular situation, it's definitely more likely that you are going to want to fortify this particular map. So, low density, high rarity, fortify is usually the way to go, especially if you're solo mapping and looking for either items or experience. So a fortified map also in general, just keep in mind that the monsters will have a ton of HP, so you're going to want to have a lot of damage. Particularly low AoE builds will also be incredibly good in that situation as well. So anything that does a ton of damage in a low area or limited area, such as potentially Frenzy, Zeal, builds that typically were kind of not that great at mapping can be so much better with fortified mapping. The same can be said of certain martial builds like Dragon Tail, which just do such an enormous amount of damage very quickly in an area, but not a huge area. So there's just a lot of builds that can benefit from this. You got to think about your build to some extent. And as for the map, rarity, especially rarity with low density, is very nice. However, you never want to fortify a map with no rarity. In my opinion, I've tested this many times. It's pretty bad. And the reason being is that what you end up getting is a map with a lot of really hard to kill monsters that aren't elite packs. You get if you get 200 to 300 density and no rarity, you end up with just a ton of monsters, especially towards the end, that are just really hard to kill. You can't get any experience from them because they're just hard to kill and they're everywhere, but they don't actually give you that much experience. So you really want to make use of that combination of stats to most effectively use the Orb of Fortification. I've gathered statistics this season and they all seem to point to that. Absolutely. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the Fortified Orb. It's definitely a cool augment to maps, and it can definitely help taking into consideration if you have a build that doesn't thrive on density, doesn't clear tons of monsters incredibly quickly, you might want to look into fortifying your maps in general, or trying to get more fortified maps to take advantage of elite pack sniping and elite pack destroying and focusing with fortified maps on builds such as the ones that I've already mentioned. Alright. And so now let's talk about kind of where the maps are at, What exactly kinds of maps are good for what kinds of things. Let's talk about kind of bad maps first, and then talk about kind of why they're not as good or not as prominent this season. So first off, we got Tomb of Zoltan Kuul. This is a tier 3 map. The major problem with it is there aren't a lot of very high experience monster types, so the experience tends to be pretty bad. Well, it also has a very large combination of high danger due to the quill rats and things of that nature. Tomb of Zoltan Kuul is one of the lowest ranking tier 3 maps in Season 6. One of the new maps as well, Ashen Plains, also falls in that category. I have definitely loved running Ashen Plains, and I definitely run even some of the worst maps quite a bit. But the main problem with Ashen Plains is, of course, it does have danger in the form of Burning Souls, but is also... you can definitely counter that without too much issue. And the boss is actually, in my opinion, kind of easy in this map. But the main problem is that there's not enough density and there's not enough experience from the monsters themselves, kind of like Tomb of Zoltan Kuul. And there's even less density than Tomb of Zoltan Kuul, making Ashen Plains the worst map of Season 6. Of course, those are the worst Tier 3 maps, the ones that kind of suffer a little bit. You could say sometimes Sewers lacks a little bit of density, but Sewers is still insanely solid and not super dangerous, and it's very quick to get through. So most people don't typically have as many problems with Sewers in that particular regard. All these other maps that I show here can be very strong, especially with certain builds or in in most group scenarios. So Canyon, Pandemonium Citadel, River, Throne, Sewers, all very good group maps and solo maps for both experience and item generation. Cow maps have always been terrible at experience, but they've been incredible with item generation. And one thing to note here is that they also have they're used for very special purposes, which I'll get to in a moment. Alright, in terms of Tier 1 maps, Lost Temple is definitely one of the worst Tier 1 maps. It's been buffed every season, but it seems like it's still not enough. Maybe it's a little too small, maybe there's still, gloams in Tier 1, so people don't really like it as much, but it's actually, in my opinion, a little underrated, but it's still not great. Area Battlefield is also still lacking some density to some extent, but maybe not a ton. The tier 1 maps that definitely get used the most, especially Torrejon I'd put kind of in the middle. Definitely insanely good for fire builds, but not insanely common. Maybe lacking some density as well. But the maps that people typically want the most seem to be Ruined Cistern, Bastion, Phlegethon, and Horizon. So you find these maps are going to be very good for farming on the vast majority of builds. The only thing that's annoying about Ruined Cistern is the boss, which is very annoying, but still an insanely good map overall, which is the new map of Season 6 for the Tier 1, which is nice. The Tier 2 maps, out of all the Tier 2 maps, definitely a lot of very solid maps here. I would say all the Tier 2 maps can be solid. Probably Shadows and Ruins aren't wanted quite as much as the other ones, but that's probably because of the most popular builds. Particularly Sanatorium and Royal Crypts seem to be in high demand in Season 6. Alright. And of course, the most valuable maps of all are the Blood Moon maps, and that's because of its supremacy for solo farming. No immunities, huge density, and monsters that even have a higher chance to drop runes. And charms, which are cows, they have slightly higher drop odds just because of their loot table for that particular monster type. Kind of like ghosts and certain other types of monsters as well. Ghosts, stormcasters, things of that nature. Alright, so overall, we've kind of gone over some of the worst ones, some of the best ones. Let's talk about like some of the very best maps and why they're the best and how to optimize them the best as well. For finding items, of course, it doesn't matter the build, that would be Blood Moon. Blood Moon, density is really a very key stat. Rarity is still amazing, but density is particularly insane on this map because of how easy it is to kill tons of cows in singular packs. You just want to pump up that density as much as possible, and you just want to value that stat as much as possible. If you're not getting a good rarity amount, you're definitely going to want to make sure density is at least 200, if not pushing 300 on these particular maps. Absolutely. So density is a bit more important on these. EXP maybe not as much because you don't really want to go for experience. And then Magic and Gold Find is also a pretty important stat as well. I would also say Rarity is maybe not as important on this particular map, but it still is. Rarity is always an amazing stat. It always increases all kinds of loot odds, including runes and things of that nature, so it's always a good stat no matter what. The number 1 map for experience and a close number 2 is be Kejistan's Marketplace. Marketplace is incredible, especially for solo experience. The problem is making a build that can both survive and clear this map quickly. I've been able to do it on some physical builds without too much difficulty this season, like Whirlwind and Warcry, but definitely the hardest thing is clearing it quickly without getting absolutely destroyed by the fire towers, whether solo or in a group. However, this is still the best tier 3 for experience. Obviously, a well-rolled dungeon in combination with a fast team will still exceed the best tier 3 map. However, it's harder to get a strong group and to push with something like that, so typically these work very well. Yeah, marketplaces were the best for solo grinding periods, so these are still amazing if you're trying to do a solo push to 99 or just trying to grind experience solo. I wouldn't say they're great for items though, so unlike Blood Moons, which are terrible at experience and great at items like, and especially charms and runes, Kejistan's is amazing for experience. Particularly stands out for solo experience grinding, but also for group experience grinding. Pandemonium Citadel is a close second though in terms of experience. Lots of high experience monsters, just like here you got in Ravelers and Fire Towers. In here you have Bloodbringers and a lot of other very high experience monsters as well, like Ghoul Lords. I mean, you also have Ghoul Lords in here as well. So you got very high experience monsters, and they're very easy to kill. Of course, Pandemonium Citadel has a very annoying boss that desyncs the screen, but besides that, it's not too bad. Canyon used to be probably like number 1 or number 2 experience-wise, you could say, just in terms of time efficiency, even over Kedgestan's, but it was nerfed, so it's still solid, but it's not like one of the very best anymore. I definitely say Canyon and Throne are a lot closer now in terms of overall efficiency, and of course River is also very close to that as well. Sewers tends to just be an insanely fast, and so it maps, so it does keep up with these other maps in terms of overall efficiency, maybe just slightly below, but it's pretty close. And of course we're talking about experience when we talk about these things. They're also all strong for items, decent for items, depending on the build. Of course, if you're going for items, you can go for strong tier 2 and tier 3 maps. If you use a filter like mine, the ADEV-DH filter on the launcher, of course you guys can see what immunities the map has. That is a pretty strong indicator based on whatever damage type you are, whether to do the map or avoid it. If it has those immunities in it, you probably should avoid it, unless you have an insanely strong negative res build or something that can break all those immunities with no problem, and then you're probably just fine. Like Warcry can, pretty much ignore physical immunity in most maps, but not every map. In some maps, it will still slow it down, like Tomb of Zoltan Cool, so just keep that in mind. So, yeah, a lot of good stuff there. Other things to consider here as well would be, for instance, your actual build. So your actual build is definitely the other thing you definitely want to consider when rolling the map. Of course, we just went over immunities a bit, and immunities are incredibly important. It's more important to consider your build if you're just running them solo, so keep that in mind. It's not really a group consideration, because in a group consideration, you'll usually have multiple damage types and normally be able to handle it. Sometimes it's not the case, but yeah, for the most part, this is a solo mapping consideration. Like, let's say you have a Rabies Druid, you definitely want to make sure you're not running poison maps. Maps like River of Blood, Throne of Insanity, Pandemonium Citadel, and Blood Moon are going to be very good. You're also going to want to prioritize different stats somewhat higher as well, and depending on what kind of build it is. A build that thrives off of density, like Rabies, for instance, which is this build, is definitely going to prioritize density maybe a bit more than other stats when running solo. It's also going to maybe not want to fortify, as it's going to mess it up, and how this build really thrives off of density destroying and killing monsters that have maybe somewhat lower HP, but a ton of them, just overall. And of course, something like a Lightning Sword, for instance, does not necessarily thrive on density quite as hard. Instead, depending on if you're going for Magic Finder experience, you might want to value the MF stat a lot higher, and of course rarity a lot higher, especially on something like a Lightning Sorceress. Of course, rarity should always be high on everyone's list, but maybe even more so for that. You might want to really try to prioritize getting that stat on any map you roll, and maybe even want to roll Fortified as well. Of course, I have, of course, given several build examples, but there's plenty of them as well. Another thing is, like, depending on the map, you might want to roll, or you might want to prioritize not having increased maximum life because you do a lower amount of damage, but it has a very wide AoE, something like Teeth maybe. You really want to make sure that stat isn't very high, because maybe your damage just is, you don't have quite enough damage in Pierce, even with the new changes, even with the Sanctuary or a piercing magic resistance. You're still going to want maybe slightly lower maximum life just to make sure the map doesn't take forever, and you want to maybe prioritize density as well, because you just have so much AoE, and so even if you don't have rarity, that's still going to be a pretty strong map maybe for that particular character. And things like Pandemonium Citadel are actually pretty good examples for that build as well. So there's a lot of things to really consider. You got to really think about your build. What immunities are in the map? How does my build work? Do I have a ton of damage to clear it? Does maximum life matter? Do I just do so much damage, like in the case of rabies, at least soloing with rabies, that, you know, I can take on 50% maximum life and avoid it. Does my build depend on maximum block? If it depends on maximum block, negative enemy block is not good unless you have a very easy counter that won't sacrifice too much damage, such as Steel Shade or something on a lot of builds. Of course, negative cast rate and things like that, if you slam it, or a negative maximum res, you just gotta think if you can survive certain things in hardcore. If you have ways to counter the negative cast rate by increasing the amount of faster cast rate on your build. So there are a lot of other considerations as well. Alright, well, at any rate, that was definitely a pretty long conversation when it comes to maps. But I hope you guys learned a lot in this. Definitely not my shortest video ever, but it's also definitely not my longest. I hope you guys will take all that information into account. Just to summarize, rarity is king. Density can matter more in more situations. And it does matter in terms of experience and Magic Find, but it can matter more or less for some builds. Magic Find only really matters if you're going for Magic Find, and experience only really matters if you're going for experience. Fortified can be very good, especially if there's rarity, and especially if there's rarity and low density. It's a great way to save an otherwise good map with rarity and to make it have maximum effectiveness. And of course, there's lots of build considerations, such as doing a ton of damage in a low area of effect that are very important for Fortified. There's definitely some maps that are better than others just overall. So, you know, some maps like Lost Temple, Area Battlefield, Ashen Plains, Tomb of Zoltan Kuul are maybe underperforming quite a bit, just overall, regardless of the build, at least in Season 6. And then, of course, some maps are king for items, like Blood Moon, are going to be extremely valuable. So if you use the Cartographer Orbs, which I always recommend making sure you cube up at least your Tier 2 maps into Tier 3 maps, you can get a lot of Blood Moons and you can sell them a ton for currency. Of course, there's also plenty of other very good maps in all tiers if you're looking for items, and plenty of good Tier 3s if you're looking for experience, depending on your build and your comps, and just depending on what you want to do. Of course, some maps like Kyrgyzstan are still absolutely king for experience as long as you can destroy them with utmost efficiency. And of course, it's very important to consider builds when you're looking into maps, especially when playing solo. Considerations like immunities and exactly how your build works, how much damage you have, can all play in to what stats you depend on your build, and other swap outs you have for your build can play into whether certain corruptions or stats are going to be very useful for your build. And that is it. That is Dark Humility with Optimal Maps and Map Ruling, Season 6 Map Report, Season 6 Edition. Let's get it. I will, of course, put timestamps below so you guys can check out all of the relevant parts of this video in case you're curious to learn more about how some of these stats work and how they can make your experience farming so much better. Dark Humility, over and out. See you guys next time.